Okay, welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in. When we look at the issue of global poverty, it is so incredibly easy to just feel completely overwhelmed, right? We open the news, we see the sheer massive scale of human suffering, and a really heavy feeling of helplessness just kind of sets in. You read about millions of people living in extreme deprivation, and honestly, it almost short circuits the brain. It's paralyzing. And look, it's completely understandable to want to look away. But today, we're going to unpack some really groundbreaking work from Poor Economics to show you exactly why we shouldn't look away and how we can actually rethink this entire challenge from the ground up. So, I want to ask you something. How do you react when you hear a statistic like every single year, 9 million children die before their fifth birthday? It's absolutely staggering, isn't it? When a problem feels that impossible, our natural human instinct is often to just freeze up. But here's the thing. If we take this massive, paralyzing issue and break it down into much smaller, understandable pieces, we can actually start to see a path forward. To do that, though, we need to really ground ourselves in the reality of the numbers. 99 cents. Now, I want you to imagine living in a city like Miami or Modesto and having to cover almost all of your everyday needs. I'm talking your food, your medicine, your clothing, the whole shebang, on just 99 cents a day. That is the actual economic reality for hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It forces a level of daily calculation and intense decision-making that most of us simply never have to face. And this brilliantly illustrates a fascinating psychological phenomenon called the empathy trap. There was this famous experiment at the University of Pennsylvania that tested how we respond to charitable appeals. They showed one group of students a flyer detailing the macro statistics of millions of starving people in Malawi and Zambia. Then, they showed another group a totally different flyer. This one was just about one identifiable 7-year-old girl from Mali named Rokia. The result? No way, you might think. But the students gave more than double the money to Rokia than they did to the millions of people. We feel incredibly compelled to help a specific, identifiable victim. But when faced with those massive, faceless macro statistics, our brains just freeze up. We feel like a tiny drop in a leaking bucket. So that brings us to the great aid debate and these big macro theories. This tension between the micro-reality of individuals and those massive macro statistics brings us right into the grand ideological clashes at the very highest levels of economics. It's kind of like watching two rival sports teams with totally different playbooks. On one side, we have Jeffrey Sachs. She argues that poor countries are stuck in geographic and systemic poverty traps, and they need a massive big push of foreign aid to break free. On the exact opposite side of the spectrum is William Easterly. He argues that aid actually does way more harm than good, that it creates corruption and destroys local markets, and that free markets and the right incentives are what truly lift people up. Now, these are brilliant economists looking at the exact same world and coming to entirely opposite conclusions. We aren't taking sides here today. We just need to understand that this massive macro debate has driven global policy for decades.
Which leads us perfectly into the anatomy of a poverty trap.
To understand who is right in any given situation, we really have to drop out of the clouds and look at the actual mechanics of poverty on the ground. So absolutely crucial point here. We need to understand what a poverty trap actually is. Think of Kennedy. He's a young Kenyan farmer from the source material. If Kennedy can't afford enough fertilizer to jumpstart his harvest, he barely grows enough food to survive, meaning, you guessed it, he has no money for fertilizer next year either. The scope for growing his income is practically zero because he's just too poor to make that initial investment. But if he could just afford that one bag of fertilizer, his income would expand dramatically. He is literally trapped. And this brings us to one of the most important visuals in all of development economics. Think of an S-shaped curve. The horizontal line is your income today, and the vertical line going up is your income tomorrow. Notice that really flat, low start on the left side of an S shape? That right there is the poverty trap zone. If you start in that zone, your future income actually shrinks or just stays completely flat. You are stuck. But if you get a big push, like Sachs suggests, maybe a free bag of fertilizer, it bumps you past that tipping point in the middle, and suddenly you enter the steep, fast part of the curve. You grow fast. In this worldview, giving things away for free is basically the only way to save someone. But wait, what if the world actually looks completely different? What if it's more like an inverted L-shaped curve? This represents Easterly's worldview. Notice with this shape, there is no flat spot at the beginning. The curve goes up fastest right at the start. This means there is no trap. In this world, our farmer Kennedy doesn't need a massive handout. He can just buy a tiny cup of fertilizer, get a tiny bit more yield, reinvest that, and slowly climb out all by himself. A massive handout here wouldn't permanently change his overall trajectory. It would just move him along a path he was already on. So the big question is, which curve is reality? So how do we know who's right? Enter the evidence revolution. This is where the whole field gets turned totally on its head. We shift away from these big macro theories debated in fancy New York offices down to the ground truth. We need actual evidence. And the way we find that evidence is through an absolute revolution in economics, randomized control trials, or RCTs. It's basically the scientific method, but applied to human behavior. Instead of just guessing, researchers like Pascaline Dupas actually went to Kenya to test reality using malaria bed nets. Step 1, take randomly selected, perfectly comparable groups of people. Step 2, offer them bed nets at different prices, some totally free, some heavily subsidized, some full price. Step 3, measure what they actually do. Do they buy them? Do they use them? By tracking real, actual behavior, rather than just relying on ideology, we can finally see which economic curve matches reality. Let's look at a really specific mystery, the hunger paradox. Let's apply this incredibly cool, evidence-based approach to a deeply ingrained assumption, the hunger-based poverty trap. Let's zoom right in on the daily choices of individual families. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization announced that over 1 billion people suffer from hunger. 1 billion. When we hear that, our immediate assumption, the logical S-curve assumption, is that the extreme poor are starving, and therefore they must desperately spend every single extra penny they get on pure calories just to build enough physical strength to work. I mean, it seems like basic biology, right? But here is the counterintuitive plot twist. When we actually look at the data, for instance, these amazingly detailed surveys from Maharashtra, India, we find that when the poor get a little extra income, they actually don't behave like they're starving. They don't buy the absolute cheapest calories, like basic millets, just to maximize their energy. Instead, there's a flight to quality. They buy tastier, much more expensive calories, like rice and wheat. They buy sugar, which is expensive and nutritionally pretty empty. They spend extra money on local festivals, tobacco, or a cup of tea. They are actively choosing not to maximize their total caloric intake. And this mystery deepens even further when we look at Robert Jensen and Nolan Miller's incredible experiment in China. They subsidize the price of basic staples, wheat and rice, for poor households. Now, basic economic theory says if something is cheaper, you buy more of it, right? That was the expected behavior. But what was the actual behavior? The households bought less of the staple grain. Because the staple was suddenly cheaper, they felt slightly richer, and they used that newfound wealth to buy more shrimp and meat instead. Their total calories didn't even increase. They just wanted better tasting food. It's fascinating. I absolutely love this quote from the source material, and it's something you should really take away from this explainer today. Precisely because they have so little, we often find them putting much careful thought into their choices. They have to be sophisticated economists just to survive. We really have to stop reducing the poor to these simplistic cartoon victims of starvation. Absolute starvation is actually quite rare. They are complex human beings making incredibly sophisticated choices for taste, for social status, for just a little bit of happiness in a very hard life. So let's talk about solving poverty step by step. So what happens when we zoom back out? How do these fascinating micro-level, totally counterintuitive discoveries change our overarching paradigm? Well, it means we have to defeat the 3 I's that dictate way too much of global policy: ideology, ignorance, and inertia. By replacing lazy top-down assumptions with concrete, tested data, we avoid building massive, multi-billion-dollar policies to solve poverty traps that might not even exist. If people aren't actually caught in a hunger trap, then dumping tons of subsidized grain into a village might not be the magic bullet we thought it was. We have to look at the real reality on the ground. And that leads us to this final thought. Poverty isn't just one monolithic, unbreakable wall. It is an incredibly rich, complex ecosystem of microeconomics. It's about bed nets, it's about fertilizer, the taste of shrimp, and the cost of sugar. It's actually a million small, solvable puzzles. So instead of being paralyzed by the impossible macro statistics we talked about at the start, I want to leave you with this challenge. If this grand problem is actually just a series of small, fascinating puzzles waiting to be solved through evidence and action, which piece will you look at first?